Gift or theft? In 1878, the German engineer Carl Humann began official excavations on the acropolis of Pergamon, present-day Bergama. This took place under the reigns of Sultan Abdul Hamid II and German Emperor Wilhelm I. Germany made a specific agreement with the Ottoman Empire to allow the altar fragments to be shipped to Berlin. It is reported that Sultan Abdul Hamid II authorized the transfer of the altar's findings in exchange for a payment of 20,000 marks. This was partly due to the Ottoman Empire's high foreign debts at the time. The legal basis for the agreement was the Ottoman Antiquities Law of 1874, the Asara Attica Ordinance. Under this law, archaeological discoveries were normally divided into three parts. One part for the state, one part for the landowner, and one part for the discoverer. The large-scale systematic excavations officially began on September 9, 1878. In 1879, the first 462 crates of marble were shipped to Germany. This video shows the large-scale relocation of the altar from a mountaintop on Turkey's west coast to a German museum in Berlin.
From Pergamon to Berlin. The relocation of the Pergamon altar in the late 19th century remains one of the most significant logistical feats in archaeological history. This is the story of how Carl Humann and his team transported a titan of the ancient world across seas and continents. The Excavation and Deconstruction, 1878-1886. The journey began on the high, wind-swept ridge of the Pergamon acropolis in modern-day Turkey. Unlike the Parthenon in Athens, the altar was not standing intact. It had been built into Byzantine walls and buried under centuries of debris. The deconstruction was a delicate process of reverse engineering. Using hammers, chisels, and primitive pulleys, workers carefully extracted the massive marble slabs, including the famous gigantomachy frieze. Each piece was numbered, documented, and packed into heavy wooden crates reinforced with iron bands to prevent the brittle marble from cracking during the vibrations of travel. Overland to the Port of Dikili, transporting these stones from the summit of the acropolis to the coast, was the first major obstacle. The terrain was rugged and lacked modern roads. To move the crates, which weighed several tons each, the team used heavy-duty ox carts and specially constructed sledges. Hundreds of laborers and teams of oxen navigated the steep, winding descent from the mountain. They built temporary ramps and reinforced paths with timber to prevent the wheels from sinking into the soft earth. The 30-kilometer journey to the Aegean port of Dikili took weeks of grueling labor under the hot Anatolian sun.
Port of Dikili. The modern world met the ancient. To move the massive crates onto ships, the engineers utilized derrick cranes, large wooden and iron cranes with hand-cranked winches, sheer legs, a tripod-like lifting device used for the heaviest blocks, and block and tackle, complex pulley systems that multiplied the strength of dozens of men to hoist the marble into the holds of steamships. The pieces were carefully lowered into the bellies of German freight steamers, cushioned by straw and timber to ensure they wouldn't shift during the voyage. The sea route to Germany. The ships departed from the Aegean Sea, charting a long course around the European continent. The route took them through the Mediterranean Sea, passing the coast of North Africa and Spain, through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic Ocean, northward along the coast of Portugal and France, crossing the often turbulent Bay of Biscay, through the English Channel and into the North Sea. The primary destination was the port of Hamburg, the gateway to the German Empire. Once in Hamburg, the crates were transferred from ocean-going vessels to river barges. These barges traveled inland via the Elbe River and the extensive network of canals connecting to the Spree River, which flows directly through the heart of Berlin. This water route allowed for the transport of massive weights that the railways of the time could not yet handle reliably. The final challenge. When the crates arrived at the Museum Island in Berlin, they faced a final architectural problem. The pieces were far too large for the existing doors of the old Altars Museum or the temporary structures. To get the altar inside, engineers laid iron tracks from the riverbank directly into the construction site of the first Pergamon Museum, and later the current one built in 1910. In many instances, the museum was literally built around the altar. For the massive frieze slabs and the architectural elements of the portico, large sections of the museum's external walls were left open or temporarily dismantled. Once inside, a forest of timber scaffolding and chain hoists allowed the masons to reassemble the great altar piece by piece, anchored to a modern brick core that remains the heart of the exhibit today. The altar, which once looked over the valley of the Caicus River, now stood silent and magnificent under the grey skies of Berlin, a monument to ancient genius and 19th century engineering. The legal controversy, gift or theft. The altar has been in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin for over a century, but since the 1990s, debate has flared up over whether it was a gift or a theft. The Pergamon Museum states that the altar was officially purchased or gifted based on an 1878 agreement between the German Empire and the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Supporters of the Berlin Museum argue that Carl Humann had official fragments, decrees, from the Sultan allowing the export of the finds to protect them from being used for lime burning by locals. The Turks' main argument is that the altar is an integral part of Bergama's geographical and historical context. The acropolis of Bergama is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but its most important structure is located 2,000 kilometers away in a museum. Turkey argues that the altar in Berlin is an isolated object, while in Bergama it is part of a vast archaeological landscape. They further argue that the agreements were concluded at a time when the Ottoman Empire was weak and under considerable political and financial pressure from Europe. They also argue that the permits were intended for research and excavation, but not necessarily for the complete export of a monumental building.